In the small town surrounded by mountains and dense forests, tranquility reigned. The locals appreciated the peaceful pace of life, where the lush nature set the rules. Among the residents was David, a highly respected firefighter who also led the town's rescue team. By his side was Charlie, a golden retriever with golden fur, famous for his impressive rescue skills. From a young age, Charlie had been trained for search missions, becoming an indispensable part of the team in the most challenging situations. The bond between David and Charlie was unbreakable, forged through years of working together and saving many lives. The dog was not just a work partner. He was a loyal friend, able to understand David with just a look. That peaceful afternoon was suddenly interrupted by alarming news. A 6-year-old boy named Lucas had disappeared while hiking on one of the forest trails with his family. His parents, frantic, reported that Lucas had wandered away from the group and vanished within minutes. Fear spread throughout the town. Everyone knew the forest, though beautiful, could be treacherous for those unfamiliar with its winding paths. For a small child, the dangers were immense. The rescue team was immediately called into action. David, as the leader, knew they had no time to waste. Nightfall was approaching, and the forest would become even more dangerous after dark. Wild animals, uneven terrain, and the rapidly dropping temperatures turned the environment into a deadly trap. David quickly gathered his gear, glancing at Charlie, who already seemed aware that a new mission was beginning. The dog, restless, sniffed the air and stared intently at the forest as if sensing he'd soon be needed. Arriving at the meeting point, David found Lucas' parents in total despair. Other locals had gathered, trying to organize improvised searches, but without clear direction. The air was thick with anxiety and fear. David knew he had to act fast. After briefly talking to the family to understand when Lucas had last been seen, he unleashed Charlie, who immediately began sniffing the ground and air around them. Charlie was a precision machine. His sense of smell, trained to detect the faintest signs of life, was their greatest weapon. David, closely watching the dog's every move, knew he had to trust his partner completely. Time was against them, and the vast forest could hide Lucas anywhere. With each passing minute, the temperature dropped further, and the night, with its intense cold, was rapidly approaching. The pair moved quickly down the trail. The forest silence was almost eerie. The only sound breaking the stillness was the rustling of leaves beneath David's boots and Charlie's swift, agile movements. The sky began to turn shades of orange and red, signaling the end of the day. Time was running out, and the approaching darkness heightened their urgency. As they ventured deeper, David felt the weight of responsibility grow heavier. Every step seemed to take them further away from safety as they delved into the unknown depths of the forest. David's heart pounded, but he remained calm. He knew that any distraction could jeopardize the search. He and Charlie had faced tough situations before, but this one felt different. The life of a child was at stake, and every lost minute could be fatal. Charlie remained fully focused. His ears were always alert, picking up every sound, while his keen nose worked tirelessly. David observed the dog's reactions closely. The connection between them was so strong that words were often unnecessary. A simple look was enough for them to understand each other. David's trust in Charlie was absolute. As the sun sank below the horizon, the forest took on an even more mysterious atmosphere. Shadows lengthened, and the temperature continued to drop. David knew they needed to find Lucas before total darkness set in. Time was their most unforgiving enemy, and the pressure was mounting. But David stayed strong. He had complete faith that Charlie would find the boy's trail. Finally, after almost an hour of walking, Charlie suddenly stopped. He began sniffing a specific spot on the trail intensely, moving in circles as if he had detected something important. David hurried over, closely observing the dog's behavior. Charlie was clearly more agitated, a sure sign that they were onto something. David looked around, and noticed a small piece of cloth snagged on a low branch. It was small but enough to indicate that Lucas had passed through here. David's heart raced. They were on the right track. The hope that had seemed distant moments ago was reignited. Charlie, with his flawless nose, had picked up Lucas' trail. With renewed energy, Charlie moved forward again, this time with more speed and determination. David followed closely, careful not to lose pace. The terrain was becoming more rugged, with tree roots sprawling across the ground and dry branches making the path difficult. But none of that mattered. The priority was to find Lucas before the cold became unbearable. With every step, the tension increased. The sky was now almost entirely dark, with only a faint glow remaining on the horizon. David knew they had to act fast. The cold was already beginning to seep through his clothes, and he feared for Lucas, who might have been exposed to the icy wind for hours. The boy was alone, vulnerable, and each passing minute escalated the risk. But David and Charlie didn't give up. The duo pressed forward with determination, trusting each other to overcome the challenges the forest presented. They knew that together, they could accomplish anything, and at that moment, Lucas' life depended on it. The cold wind whistled through the trees, sweeping away the last warmth of the day as the sun disappeared entirely over the horizon. The forest seemed to close in around David and Charlie, making every step more challenging. The path was becoming harder to follow as shadows lengthened and the surroundings grew darker. The rustling branches above, which might have been soothing in other circumstances, only heightened the tension that night. Charlie kept forging ahead, sniffing the ground, searching for new clues. His senses were sharp, as if he knew that every second counted. The dog was used to difficult missions, but the urgency of this situation felt different. He instinctively knew that a child's life was in danger, and this seemed to fuel his determination. His movements were quick and precise, and David followed with equal focus. The terrain was becoming more treacherous, filled with thick roots and scattered dry branches. The trail that had once been visible was now almost indistinguishable, covered by fallen leaves and debris carried by the wind. Every step required David to balance carefully, while Charlie, with the agility typical of his breed, moved effortlessly. David's confidence in his partner never wavered, but the pressure of time weighed heavily on his mind. As they pressed on, the air grew heavier, and the forest silence was almost deafening. David felt the cold intensify as twilight shifted into night. He knew that if they didn't find Lucas soon, the rescue would become even more difficult. The falling nighttime temperatures would make the situation critical, especially for a child exposed to the elements for so long. Charlie abruptly stopped, sniffing the ground with greater focus. Something had caught his attention. David, always attuned to the dog's signals, quickly approached. Charlie was sniffing the dirt and nearby branches with intense concentration. David recognized the behavior immediately. Charlie always acted like this when they were close to something important. It didn't take long for David to spot what it was. A small piece of cloth caught in a low bush, barely noticeable among the leaves. David's heart raced. This could be a crucial clue. He crouched down to pick up the cloth, which appeared to be part of a child's clothing. Holding it for a moment, he felt hope reignite. Lucas had passed through here. Charlie had picked up the boy's trail once again. "Good boy," David muttered, patting Charlie's head quickly before continuing forward. Charlie, ever alert, sniffed the cloth and resumed leading the way with renewed energy. The dog seemed certain they were heading in the right direction, and this gave David the strength to push forward, despite the exhaustion beginning to set in. They were racing against time, but now, with the concrete clue, their chances of finding Lucas had significantly increased. The terrain became even more rugged as they moved forward. Tree roots seemed to multiply, turning the ground into a dangerous maze. David had to step carefully to avoid tripping or twisting an ankle. Charlie, on the other hand, remained agile, constantly sniffing the air and ground, searching for the slightest sign that would lead them to Lucas. Time seemed to speed up as the night fully descended. Darkness now engulfed the forest, and visibility was almost zero. David switched on his flashlight, illuminating the path ahead, but the weak beam barely penetrated the dense fog that was beginning to form around them. The biting cold only heightened the urgency. The temperature was plummeting, and David knew that Lucas wouldn't survive much longer if they didn't reach him soon. As they continued their treacherous walk, the atmosphere became more oppressive. David could feel the exhaustion in his legs, but he couldn't stop. He had to trust Charlie and stay focused. They were close, he could feel it. Suddenly, Charlie stopped again, this time sniffing a specific spot on the ground more intensely. His ears perked up, and he began digging with his paws, scattering leaves and dirt. David quickly knelt beside him, his heart pounding. "What did you find, boy?" David whispered, his hope growing. After a few seconds of frantic digging, Charlie stopped and looked up at David with his sharp, focused eyes. David, kneeling next to the dog, shone his flashlight over the area. And then, among the thick tree roots, he saw a small, curled-up figure. His heart leaped. It was Lucas. The boy was huddled up, shivering from the cold, but he was conscious. His wide eyes reflected fear, but also relief as he saw Charlie and David approaching. He was clearly exhausted and freezing, but he was alive. David felt a wave of emotion and relief wash over him. They had found him. David quickly crouched down and scooped the boy into his arms, trying to warm him with his own body. Lucas was weak, barely able to speak, but he managed to grasp David's jacket with a feeble grip. The rescue wasn't over yet. They needed to get out of there fast before the cold worsened the situation. Charlie, always vigilant, stood by David and Lucas, ready to guide them back down the trail. The golden retriever had fulfilled his mission of finding the boy, but now the priority was to get Lucas safely out of the forest. The challenge wasn't over yet. With Lucas cradled in his arms, David looked at Charlie and gave a small nod. They needed to head back. The rescue journey was only halfway complete, and the night had just begun. With hope in his heart, but his mind still focused on the task ahead, David followed Charlie down the trail, confident that the worst was behind them, though knowing the return would be just as challenging. With Lucas safe in his arms, David felt the weight of responsibility grow heavier. Although they had found the boy, the rescue was far from over. Night had fully fallen, and the forest seemed to become more hostile with each passing minute. The biting cold pierced through their clothes, and the wind that blew through the trees brought with it a clear warning. They needed to get out of there fast. Charlie kept moving ahead, sniffing the way back with the same precision as before. The dog was tireless, even after hours of searching. He seemed to understand that the danger was no longer just the fact that Lucas had been lost, but now the time they had to get back to safety. Every minute counted, and the relentless cold only made things worse. David held Lucas closer to his body, trying to provide as much warmth as possible. The boy trembled uncontrollably, and his irregular breathing indicated that the cold was already affecting him. Lucas' small hands clutched David's jacket tightly, as if holding on to life itself. David knew that if they didn't move quickly, hypothermia could set in, and that would be devastating. As they continued along the treacherous trail, the rugged terrain seemed to work against them. Thick roots and dry branches littered the ground, and David had to be careful with each step since any stumble could be disastrous, especially with Lucas in his arms. The boy's weight felt heavier with each passing moment, not due to his size, but because of the extreme fatigue setting into David's body. Physical exhaustion was beginning to take its toll, but his mind remained focused on one mission: getting Lucas out of the forest alive. The forest felt even more threatening now. The winds howling echoed through the trees, and the rustling leaves added to the sense of total isolation. Each sound was amplified by the silence, as if nature itself was watching their struggle against time. The darkness was almost complete, and only David's weak flashlight provided any visibility. But what kept him most alert was Charlie, always ahead, guiding them through the blackness with his unwavering confidence. The cold, already intense, seemed to become unbearable as they pushed forward. The temperature dropped rapidly, and David felt its effects on his hands and feet, which were beginning to go numb.
Before we continue with this exciting story, make sure you are already subscribed to the channel and leave a like on this video to always stay up to date with new content.
He looked at Lucas and saw the boy's lips turning blue, a clear sign that the cold was causing serious harm. Time was running out. Charlie stopped for a moment, sniffing the air more intensely. He looked back at David, checking to see if he was okay, and then returned to sniffing the ground. The dog knew the situation was dire, and his behavior showed a quiet urgency. He was leading David and the boy along the safest path, avoiding obstacles and keeping them away from the invisible dangers that the forest could hide. David felt himself running out of strength, but couldn't afford to stop. He knew that if he collapsed, there would be no way out of the situation. His breathing was heavy, and his muscles ached with each step. Yet every time he glanced at Charlie, he saw the dog's unwavering determination, which gave him the strength to continue. They had faced difficult situations before, but this was by far the most challenging. The cold was relentless, and the darkness seemed endless. With each step, David fought against exhaustion. He knew that if they stopped, Lucas might not survive. The boy was already weak, trembling uncontrollably, and his eyes, though open, showed signs of confusion and extreme fatigue. Keeping Lucas warm and conscious was the priority, but the conditions around them made that task increasingly difficult. The sound of a branch snapping in the distance made David pause for a moment. He looked around, his senses on high alert, but he couldn't see anything beyond the oppressive darkness of the forest. His heart raced, and for a brief moment, he felt fear creep in. Whatever was out there, watching or moving, was unknown. Perhaps it was just an animal, but the uncertainty made him tense. Charlie, however, wasn't fazed. He continued moving forward, ignoring the sounds around them, focused only on leading them down the right path. The dog seemed to know there was no time for distractions. Every second was precious, and any unnecessary delay could cost them dearly. As they followed the ever-darkening, freezing trail, David began to recognize familiar landmarks. The vegetation was changing, and he noticed trees with twisted trunks and a large rock that served as a marker. Relief started to build in his chest. They were closer to the exit than he had thought. The meeting point couldn't be far now. With this new hope, David squeezed Lucas gently, trying to transfer some warmth to the boy. Lucas wasn't speaking, but his eyes, though confused, showed a flicker of hope. He was conscious enough to realize that he was being rescued, and that was all that mattered at the moment. Finally, after a few more minutes of walking, a distant flashlight beam cut through the darkness. David almost couldn't believe what he was seeing. The meeting point was near. His heart raced, and he felt a wave of relief wash over him. They were almost there. He looked at Charlie, still confidently leading the way, and knew they had made it. The forest exit was just ahead. With renewed energy, David quickened his pace. Lucas was weak, but the proximity of help allowed him to hold on a little longer. The cold wind still bit at them, but now, with the lights in sight, it seemed less severe. The initial desperation had faded, and hope was taking over. As they neared the meeting point, the voices of the rescue team became audible. They were calling out David and Lucas' names, trying to locate them in the darkness. David shouted back with all the strength he had left, and soon the faces of the rescuers appeared, illuminated by their flashlights. Paramedics rushed toward them, ready to take care of Lucas. Lucas' parents were there, visibly distressed, but when they saw David carrying their son, their faces lit up with relief and gratitude. They ran toward him, tears in their eyes, and the paramedics quickly took Lucas, wrapping him in thermal blankets and checking his vital signs. Though exhausted, David felt an indescribable sense of accomplishment. Charlie, by his side, finally relaxed, lying down on the ground, knowing the mission was complete. They had overcome the darkness, the cold, and the fear, and now they could finally rest. The meeting point was finally in sight, and the overwhelming sense of relief filled David's exhausted body. Despite the extreme fatigue and tension that had built up over the past hours, he knew the worst was behind them. Lucas was in the arms of paramedics, receiving the first bit of care while his parents stood by, tears of gratitude streaming down their faces. Charlie, lying next to David, was visibly tired, but his eyes remained watchful, as if waiting for the next command. But there would be no more orders that night. They had completed their mission. Lucas was safe, and the night that had begun in panic and fear was now ending in victory for the rescue team. Still, the relief coursing through David's body didn't erase the physical exhaustion. His legs ached, his arms were numb after carrying Lucas for so long, and his mind was racing with thoughts. But above all else, what prevailed was gratitude for having reached this point successfully. The paramedics wrapped Lucas in thermal blankets while his parents, still in disbelief at having their son back, knelt beside him, caressing his face and holding his small hands. The boy, clearly very weak, looked around with sleepy eyes, not fully aware of what was happening. But he was conscious enough to know he was safe. David watched the scene with a quiet sense of satisfaction. He knew that without Charlie, this story could have had a very different ending. The dog's instinct, tireless dedication, and innate skills in dangerous situations had been crucial in locating the boy and bringing him back. Without Charlie, the chances of success would have been slim. The forest was treacherous, especially at night, and finding a lost child in such a vast area was like looking for a needle in a haystack. David knelt and ran his hand over Charlie's head, and the dog wagged his tail lightly. The golden retriever, despite his exhaustion, seemed content with the outcome of his mission. He knew he had done his job, once again proving himself to be the hero the town already knew him to be. The dog had always been a symbol of hope in rescue missions, and tonight was no different. His expressive brown eyes seemed to convey a sense of calm, as if telling David that everything was okay now. The sounds around them began to fade. The chatter of the rescue team and the locals who had helped in the search gradually gave way to a comforting silence. The cold wind still blew through the trees, but now the sense of danger that had once accompanied it was gone. Nature seemed to have finally accepted that the mission was successful. Lucas, now warmer and safer, began to relax. His eyes were heavy, and he seemed on the verge of falling asleep, exhausted from the ordeal he had endured. The boy had been brave, but the cold and fear had clearly taken their toll. David knew that Lucas still had a long road to recovery, both physically and emotionally. But the most important thing was that he was there, alive and safe in his parents' arms. Lucas' parents approached David and Charlie. Still emotional, they could barely speak, but their eyes said everything. Lucas' mother gripped David's hand tightly, squeezing it in a gesture of silent gratitude. Lucas' father, his eyes filled with tears, knelt down to pet Charlie's head, thanking the rescue dog who had made the impossible happen that night. No words could fully express their relief, but David knew that his work went far beyond words. What really mattered was seeing the family reunited. Charlie, as always, remained calm and collected as he received affection from Lucas' parents. The dog, who had been on countless rescue missions, seemed to understand the significance of each one but never got caught up in the moment. He always knew that after each mission, another one awaited, and his focus remained on the next challenge. But tonight, even Charlie seemed to relax a little more than usual, perhaps recognizing that this mission had been especially difficult. Finally allowing himself to sit beside Charlie, David stretched out his tired legs and watched the scene around him. The paramedics were finishing their examination of Lucas, and soon the boy would be taken to the hospital for a more thorough evaluation. His parents stayed by his side, unable to take their eyes off him, still fearing that danger might be lurking, even though they knew he was out of harm's way. It was the natural reflex of the fear and trauma they had endured over the past hours. With the rescue nearly complete, the search team began to disperse. Some townspeople who had helped in the improvised search stood by, relieved to see the night's positive outcome. David and Charlie's names would soon echo through the streets, just as they had many times before. But for David, the greatest reward was what was happening right in front of his eyes. Lucas was safe, and his family was whole again. Charlie, finally lying down completely, rested beside David as the ambulance that would take Lucas to the hospital prepared to depart. The headlights illuminated the forest darkness, and the sound of the engine was the only noise breaking the night silence. The cold was still present, but now it seemed less cruel, as if the forest had accepted that it had lost the battle tonight. Life had triumphed. Lucas' parents thanked David and Charlie once more, tears in their eyes, before heading to the ambulance to accompany their son. David waved in response, still sitting next to Charlie, watching as the ambulance slowly pulled away. A deep sense of accomplishment filled his heart, but he knew that the true hero was lying right next to him. Charlie had saved the day once again. The sound of the ambulance faded into the distance, leaving behind the quiet of the night as it once again took over the forest. The rescue team, though relieved by the mission's success, remained alert. There was a sense of satisfaction in the air, but also the understanding that every rescue carried its emotional weight. Lucas' parents were on their way to the hospital with their son, and David finally allowed himself to relax next to Charlie, the true hero of the night. David slowly stood up, feeling the weight of exhaustion in his body. The hours of walking and tension seemed to have drained his last reserves of energy, but the thought that Lucas was safe and sound eased any physical discomfort. He glanced at Charlie, still lying down, breathing deeply, clearly tired but vigilant. The golden retriever never failed to carry out his mission, even when the job seemed finished. The rescue team approached to congratulate David and Charlie, praising the impeccable work they had done. Everyone knew that without Charlie's keen sense of smell and David's experience, the outcome of the night could have been tragic. The team members, who had also given their all during the search, showed their respect with quiet handshakes and hugs. "This dog is incredible, David," one of the paramedics remarked, smiling as he petted Charlie's head. "The whole town will be talking about him tomorrow." David just nodded, too tired to respond, but a subtle smile appeared on his face. He knew Charlie was much more than a local hero. To him, Charlie was a partner, a friend who had been by his side in the toughest moments. The trust they shared was rare, and it showed in every mission they undertook together. The lantern lights still illuminated the area, but the sense of urgency had passed. The freezing night wind that once seemed relentless now felt like just another detail, and the silence of the forest offered a certain comfort. The danger had been overcome, and the rescue team, though exhausted, was ready to head back to town and officially close the mission. David looked up at the dark sky, where stars were beginning to appear, and felt a strange peace. The adrenaline from the mission was wearing off, and his body was finally adjusting to the accumulated exhaustion. He knew a firefighter and rescuer's job was never over, but that moment of silence and reflection was needed. It was time to absorb everything that had happened. He thought about Lucas and how the boy had been so strong, even in the face of fear and the biting cold. The forest could have been his grave, but now it would just be a memory of survival. And for Lucas' parents, that night of terror would soon be replaced by eternal gratitude. Charlie, finally getting up, wagged his tail lightly, as if knowing it was time to go. He looked at David with his warm, expressive brown eyes, as if asking what the next step was. David chuckled softly. "Ready to head home, partner?" he asked, petting Charlie's head, who responded with a light bark, as if saying he was ready for the next mission, but wouldn't mind a good night's sleep first. The team began packing up their gear and preparing for the walk back to town. The return journey would be easier now, without the pressure of finding someone lost, and the pace would be slower. David knew he needed some time to process everything that had happened that night. Each rescue left its mark, and this one would be no different. Lucas' face, his scared eyes, and the relief of being found by Charlie would stay with him for a long time. As they walked back down the trail, David reflected on how fragile life was and how every decision, every step taken in that forest had been crucial to the outcome of this mission. If they had taken any longer, if Charlie hadn't picked up Lucas' scent in time, the outcome could have been completely different. But here they were, with yet another successful mission. The quiet of the walk was broken only by the soft sound of David's boots on the leaf-covered ground. He glanced at Charlie again, walking by his side with the same determination as always, though clearly tired. The bond between them had never been stronger. Every mission reinforced the mutual trust and respect they shared. Finally, the lights of the town began to appear in the distance. They were nearing civilization again, and David knew that soon the streets would be filled with talk about the rescue. Charlie's name would be spoken with pride, and Lucas' parents would probably never forget what the dog had done for them. But for David, what really mattered was knowing that in the midst of chaos, Charlie's courage and loyalty had prevailed once again. When they reached the town's entrance, the rescue team dispersed, each heading home, relieved but aware that another call could come at any time. David and Charlie continued walking together, heading toward their home. There, they could finally rest and prepare for whatever came next. But for tonight, the town's hero could sleep peacefully.
Thanks for watching until the end. What did you think of today's story? Leave your opinion in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Until next time.